let's talk about what the muscle endurance tree is, and then let's define everything inside of the muscle endurance tree, because muscle endurance is a specific thing inside of the muscle
Inside of
endurance
it.
tree. So we have muscle endurance at the base of the muscle endurance tree, but it's important to realize that before you get to the base of the muscle endurance tree, there's motor learning or motor control that has to be established.
Yep.
So you have to learn how to move first before you try to dive into muscle endurance and increasing that. You need to know how to move, pattern specifically. So muscle endurance or motor control is before you get into the tree. The base of the tree is muscle endurance. And then we have strength endurance. And then we have max contractions. And then we have aerobic muscle endurance. And then we have battery.
Love it.
All right,
That is
that's
a
it.
muscle endurance tree. Guys, we
That's
have a very pretty infographic that lays that all out visually with examples and some program design examples too inside of that free download and that free course. So if you want a little bit of a visual to try and see what Carl was just describing, I know you can see it as you describe it.
Yeah,
but
no,
the,
it's we almost
listeners,
need.
what are you doing here?
I don't. I'm making the tree.
Like climbing a wall.
I don't want to. I always want to say like, oh, can we just like throw a graphic on this? And then Emma is back there and Jacob somewhere is probably like, no, don't say that. We don't like. I know that's a lot more work than it sounds, but that
Well,
would be beneficial to instead of me doing this like a climbing
just
a ladder
climbing.
like a it was a mime
A mime.
mime
A mime.
yeah, that deal.
Yeah, well, unfortunately for people on audio, a graphic wouldn't be too helpful to those listening to the podcast.
Then we just say, hey, go to YouTube, watch the podcast.
This is true. You guys do have that option. The world is your oyster.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the muscle endurance tree. So let's define each one of those pieces.
Sounds good.
So muscle endurance first. So muscle endurance is just the ability to push work out. I always just say to the right. I hope people know what I mean when I say to the right. It's like time increases as we go to the right. So we're pushing contractions out to the right. Muscle endurance, we always get the question, what is the difference between muscle endurance and strength endurance? So muscle endurance, the challenge in muscle endurance is your motor control is being challenged. So your ability to keep good technique, your ability to keep full ranges of motion, if that's the intent, all of those things are challenged. So I always like to use the air squats. I'll use the air squat again. So a bunch of air squats, 150 air squats, let's say unbroken or with like a quick breath at the top, would be an example of true muscle endurance or a true muscle endurance task. What's going to break down, and you see it in like a workout like Murph, right? Like how do air squats look in Murph?
I want to get up and demonstrate one right now, but it's like the butt goes down and the hands go forward.
Yeah.
That like just like torso lean that happens. And it's hilarious you said that because that's what I was visualizing as you were talking about muscle endurance. I was thinking about some of the air squats that I have seen and I have done myself doing Murph.
Yeah. But it's still a good rep, quote unquote, right? So what's being challenged there? Motor control, or like what we would just call technique is being challenged. So that's the truest level of muscle endurance. So load isn't really a thing. It's just you have a lot of reps. You're trying to keep good quality as you go to the right in time. Strength endurance, it's the same exact idea, but now the limiter is tension.
Yep.
So tension is higher in strength endurance. So muscle endurance is 150 air squats. Strength endurance is 25 front squats with 65% of your 1 rep max on there. That's not like scientifically backed or anything like that, but you get the idea. It's like a little bit heavier. The reps are a lot lower, but you can kind of wrap your head around how tough that would be. Or like a 20 rep back squat. I'm sure a lot of people have done that. You can kind of feel or understand how that feels with like a quick breath at the top, right back down, quick breath. That's tension is challenging you being able to push that out to the right. Max contractions, easy, right? Like that's like the highest level of tension. So we are lifting very heavy loads. So it's like 1, 2, 3 rep maxes in any pattern.
Yep.
So that's a max contraction. And then we have aerobic muscle endurance. So that is the idea of making muscle endurance sustainable, and you're doing other things around that. So I know we used Murph. Murph isn't a great example of that because that's more of like a chipper. You're just doing a bunch of work. But just imagine partitioning Murph, right? So I know when people do Murph, they'll do I don't even know the thing. Like
5, 10, 15 for 20 rounds.
yes.
Yeah.
So that would be a good example of aerobic muscle endurance, just because we're like really thinking about that air squat. So we're doing that. So we're running, we're doing the air squats, we're doing the pull-ups, we're doing the push-ups, we're going back to the air squats. So you're making that aerobic, right? So the ability to keep good quality in that aerobic setting.
And that was a challenging idea that James kind of brought forth, and probably some other people as well. But I know that notion of making contractions like an air squat, like a push up, like a pull up, aerobic contractions is something that's kind of unsettling and unknown in the strength and conditioning world.
Yeah, for sure. And for good reason, because most people shouldn't do it.
Yes.
And we talked about that last week on our webinar. We talked about metabolic conditioning, and that was something that we hit on. It's like, hey, everyone, like there's a progression to this thing, and you can't just throw, old Susan in there. Susan's my mom's name, so I'm gonna use my mom. Can't throw old Susan in there. Not calling my mom old, but can't throw Susan in there and say, hey, I want you to do this 20 rounds for time, air squat, push up, pull up thing, right? And I want that to be really aerobic. Susan's gonna go in and do like 10 air squats and take a breath, and she's like, oh my gosh, like I'm actually training like some muscle endurance stuff. And then you know what I mean. So
For
it's
sure.
not going to be aerobic and sustainable, and most people fall into that camp. So this is just a framework that's laid out to say, hey, you need to do these things and then these things and then these things before you can do that.
Yeah.
And nothing's perfect, right? Like no framework is like, okay, check that off. Now I can move to the next one. Check that off. Like there's no test or assessment that you can do really that says like I'm exactly here, right? Or I'm exactly there. But it's a great framework to think about when stuff goes wrong and you're like, oh, maybe I need to think about taking a step back and working on this characteristic and contractions before I go up and do that.
For sure. If we see Susan attempting to do Murph and her knees are caving in her squats and she's snaking through her push ups, maybe we want to go back and think, did Susan spend adequate time developing motor control in her squat and push patterns? Did she then do muscle endurance work and build a good base of that? Did we take her into strength endurance? Has she shown the ability to express max contractions before we get into that aerobic muscle endurance work?
Yep, absolutely.
We got one more piece at the top of this tree.
Yeah, battery. So battery is moving high percentages of load relative to the maximum amount of load that you can lift. So let's call it like 70%, 75%, 80%, 90% of load over and over and over across a certain amount of time or a certain amount of reps. So a classic test that we use for battery testing is test your 1 rep max power clean, rest 8 minutes, and then go an 8-minute AMRAP of power cleans at 90% of that 1 rep max. So that's a battery test. So tension is very high. It feels like you're performing max contraction reps actually because the percentage is so high. But because you've built up such a battery, you're able to do it, drop it, take a breath, creatine phosphate, ATP, that all regathers, and okay, I can do it again, drop, redo it again. And you see some fairly impressive things that athletes can do when they have high levels of battery capabilities. And I said athletes specifically because no one else really needs to do battery training.
For sure. I mean, I've definitely given battery training to people who who didn't need to do it. And I've given battery training to people who have not progressed up those levels of the muscle endurance tree. And you can look at that and be like, wow, they just did 45 reps of their 1RM in 8 minutes. They must have a great battery. But then you look at what that 1RM was, and it was so low, absolutely, because they have not spent time, again, working up that tree to the point that they can express a true maximal contraction.
Well, low relatively.
Relatively.
For them.
Yes.
Yeah. Because they can't express. Yeah, they can't express, right? So that's a really good point. Yeah, I've done that too, where it's like, oh, that's a good score. And you're like, but you power cleaned 85 pounds. Like that, actually, we shouldn't even be doing that.
Yeah.
So it is a game of like relativity based on what they're able to do and knowing what solid scores are, absolutely. Because you can have an absolute beginner that's like, oh, relatively, that was high for you. You just PR'd, but that doesn't mean absolutely they're strong.
Sure.
And again, there's no number that's like, okay, you can do the battery test with someone once they hit this absolute number. That's the art of coaching, right? Like you have to understand where people sit relative to what their potential is. Because you'll have people that have low potential of a lower potential to be strong in the power clean. And if you're like chasing 200 pounds for a female, and that female doesn't have the potential to ever do that, it's like you're just playing this game that you're never going to accomplish. It's like, yes, she power cleaned 160. That's her potential. You can like look at her and say, okay, I want you to do 160 again. And like it's just not happening. She
Yeah.
fails it off the ground. You're like, okay, you're probably getting close to that potential. So for that person, it's like, yeah, let's do some battery testing, some battery training and stuff like that.
Yeah, whole other conversation inside of that, and looking at individual potential and how that affects training for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Just like one more thing on battery before we go to broader conversation around the muscle endurance tree, but in years ago, I saw that battery word pop up online as I was researching program design and looking at other people's designs and things like that. And that's one of the things that drew me back to OPEX was like, what is this battery thing that people are talking about? Just a side note.
Yeah, it's a sexy thing, and it's one of those things where like you want to geek out about and like use, but you just don't need to use it with most people.
Very true.
Yeah, it's
Very
it's
true.
very insightful though, especially for like CrossFit athletes, right? Or like IF3 athletes. It's something that is used, right? It's like it's something that is tested often. So
What is it that's being tested, just as a side note, and why does it need to be used in that sport?
what do you mean? What is it that's being like? What's an example of a workout?
Like
Or
physiologically, what are you testing with battery?
yeah, it's the reproduction of CP and ATP.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you do a hard contraction, and how quickly can you recover from that hard contraction to do it again and again and again and again? So that's why there's some connectivity between aerobic muscle endurance and battery. They're not the same thing because tension is a lot higher in battery, but just how we talked about muscle endurance and strength endurance, I would look at aerobic muscle endurance and battery as having that same relationship where battery tension is just way higher.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And those are both characteristics that you see inside the sport of mixed modal, inside of CrossFit.
Yep.
Yeah.
For
Okay.
sure.